But today, to kickstart this year's series, we are delighted to welcome 3 ADR UK Fellows. So we have Ezgi Kaya, Xiaowei Xu, and Francesca Foliano. And they're here to share insights from their research using ADR England flagship datasets and the benefits of using administrative data. So we're going to start with Ezgi. So I'm going to hand over to you and I will join you at the end for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction and thank you for having me. I believe you can see on my screen.
Yep, all good to go.
Perfect, thank you. So good morning, everyone. I'm Ezgi Kaya from Cardiff University, and I will be talking about my ADR UK Research Fellowship today, and that aim to explore the nexus between immigration, integration, and labour market outcomes based on data from the annual survey of hours and earnings linked to 2011 Census of England and Wales. And the data is accessed through the ONS Secure Research Service, and the usual disclaimer applies in terms of the analysis and the interpretation of these data. Just to give a little bit of a context, migration flows and the share of the foreign population have risen significantly in recent decades, and the UK is not an exception. So if you look at the recent census in 2021, 10 million people residing in England and Wales were born outside the UK. This is around 1 in 6 people, and a 2.5 million increase since 2011. The growing diversity of the population obviously has brought several important questions, and one of them is the immigrants' labour market performance and integration. Not surprisingly, there has been considerable academic interest to understand the labour market performance of UK-born employees and how they fare in the labour market. While valuable, existing UK evidence has primarily focused on pay as the main labour market outcome. And this information often relies on household survey data, which is based on self-reported information. So what we did in this project is we aim to provide new, high quality and comprehensive evidence on the labour market performance and integration of immigrant employees in England and Wales. And we are using a novel data source. As I mentioned, that's the annual survey of hours and earnings, ASH in short, linked to 2011 census. ASH is a well-known and one of the most reliable resources of earnings and hours in the UK. It also includes detailed information on various labour market outcomes, such as occupation, type of employment contracts. It also has a linked employee-employer structure. So using de-identified information, one can compare co-workers employed by the same employer and make comparisons in terms of their labour market outcomes too. It's also possible to track the same de-identified individuals over time. So you can look at how the labour market performance or the gaps evolve over time. However, like many administrative data sets, payroll-based ASH lacks information on various personal characteristics that might be important in terms of labour market performance. The linked version with census includes a rich set of personal and family characteristics coming from the census. Most importantly for this project, now we have information on the country of birth of employees to distinguish between UK-born and non-UK-born individuals. We also have information on factors that are often associated with immigrant integration, such as years of residence or English language proficiency. With this data, what we did was focusing on a working age population who were paid an adult rate, whose earnings are unaffected by absence in the linkage year. So our definition of immigrants would be based on country of birth information. So we define individuals born outside the UK as immigrants. Hence, our focus is the first generation immigrants. We also categorize immigrants based on their duration of residence in the UK. This is mainly motivated by the existing empirical evidence that suggests that 10 or more years of residence in the host country could result in catch up with the UK-born population labor market outcomes. So we looked at long-term immigrants and more recent immigrants separately. And all our comparisons are drawn with respect to UK-born population. Our methodology is based on well-established quantitative methods, and we use the cross-sectional element from the 2011 data, but also we utilize the longitudinal nature of the data and track individuals over time. And today's talk will focus on the key findings from the main research questions of the project. So our initial aim was to look at the labor market outcomes beyond pay, including hours of work, occupational skill level, and type of employment contract, and see how these outcomes differ between UK-born and immigrant employees. If we identify any differences, the next question was to understand their drivers. So we looked at the role of employee characteristics as well as employer characteristics and how they influence the observed differences. We also considered different groups of immigrants by factors that are often associated with immigrant integration, such as language proficiency or national identity. And we also looked at how the identified gaps evolve over time. Now I will show you a series of figures in relation to each research question, and they will all have very similar structure. So the first question was to understand the gaps that we observe between UK-born population and immigrant employees by their years of residence. So the first outcome we considered, consistent with the existing academic literature, was hourly gross pay. So here, each bar represents the pay gap with respect to UK-born population. And the green bar is for long-term immigrants, and the orange one is for more recent immigrants. The figure suggests that long-term immigrants, when we make comparisons on average with respect to UK-born population, earn around 13% more, while more recent immigrants earn around 9% less compared to UK-born employees. In terms of their weekly paid hours, long-term immigrants' weekly hours seem to be similar to the UK-born employees, in fact, not statistically different from zero, while more recent immigrants tend to work longer hours per week compared to UK-born employees. In terms of probability of employment in low-skilled occupations, long-term immigrants are slightly less likely to be employed in low-skilled occupations, while recent immigrants are significantly more likely to be employed in these roles. And in terms of probability of temporary employment, we find that, again, more recent immigrants are significantly more likely to be employed in this type of contracts, while long-term immigrants do not exhibit any statistical difference relative to UK-born employees. Obviously, these comparisons are made based on the average immigrant and an average UK-born employee. And hence, some of these differences may be attributed to various characteristics. When we look at the data, for instance, compared to UK-born employees, immigrants are more likely to have a degree, they are more likely to be married and have dependent children, they are more likely to work in London, healthcare industry, and professional and elementary occupations. There are also significant ethnicity differences between immigrant population and the UK-born employees. Also, within immigrant groups, we observe differences in characteristics. For instance, more recent immigrants are younger, and they have a shorter length of employment with their employer relative to long-term immigrants. Similarly, compared to UK-born employees, more recent immigrants are less likely to have a long-term health problem or disability. They are less likely to work part-time. They are less likely to be covered by collective agreements, while long-term immigrants are more comparable to UK-born employees in these dimensions. Given all these differences, our next question was to account for these characteristics. So when we account for these characteristics, do we still observe differences in labor market outcomes? And here are similar figures after accounting for characteristics differences between UK-born and immigrant employees. As you will see, all the bars will be shorter here, meaning that the gaps will be narrower. And in fact, for long-term immigrants, we no longer observe an hourly pay advantage, while for recent immigrants, we still observe around 5% pay gap with recent immigrants earning less than UK-born counterparts. A similar picture will emerge in all the other outcomes we consider. More recent immigrants are working longer hours again, weekly. They are more likely to be employed in low-skilled occupations, and they are more likely to be in temporary jobs. While long-term immigrants are much more similar to the UK-born population in all the labor market outcomes we consider. These comparisons so far are made among the population that have similar characteristics in terms of education, region of employment, as well as industry. However, we are not making comparisons so far among the co-workers. So the next question we asked was particularly for recent immigrants, where we observe differences in all labor market outcomes, even after accounting for characteristics. We try to understand the role of employers in these gaps that we identify. So we make the comparisons among the co-workers. In fact, quantitative methods allow us to quantify the exact role employers play. Focusing on, in this table, we are showing all the observed labor market outcome gaps between recent immigrants and UK-born employees. For instance, focusing on the hourly pay gap, it's around 8%. And we are trying to understand how much of it can be explained by the fact that immigrant employees and UK-born employees are employed by different types of firms. This is sizable, which explains around a quarter of the observed hourly pay gap. This is mainly because immigrant employees are more likely to be employed in low-paid firms. However, a sizable proportion of the gap still exists, even the comparisons are made among co-workers with similar characteristics. So within employers, we still observe gaps in hourly pay. And this is true for all the other labor market outcomes we consider. The next question we asked was about the factors that are related to immigrant integration, such as language proficiency. So do we observe these differences between recent immigrants and UK-born employees, even if we make comparisons among those who are, for instance, proficient in English? In most cases, gaps between UK-born employees and recent immigrants are narrower for immigrants who are proficient in English, who hold a UK passport, or who identify as British nationals. However, significant gaps still exist, even the comparisons are made among co-workers with similar characteristics in all the groups that we consider. The final question was related to the progression of these gaps that we identify. So do these gaps that we observe between recent immigrants and UK-born employees narrow over time? And what we observe is that there's slow convergence in all the labor market outcomes. So recent immigrants' probability of employment in low-skilled or temporary jobs tend to converge to that of UK-born employees from the year of their arrival. However, we have limited evidence of convergence in terms of hourly pay and weekly hours, with the gap remaining substantial even after 10 years since arrival. This has been a brief overview of the project findings and a couple of final remarks in terms of this project. The linked dataset obviously provides a novel source to analyze the labor market performance of immigrant employees, and our analysis offers a comprehensive picture by examining outcomes beyond pay thanks to the richness of this data. Our findings reveal significant differences among immigrant groups and compared to UK-born employees across various outcomes, and it highlights the importance of accounting for employee characteristics in measuring labor market inequality and the significant role of employer-specific factors, such as where employees work, but also the inequalities within employers. However, our analysis is not free of limitations. We don't have information in the data, for instance, on reasons for migration. And also we don't have comparable linked data for later census years, at least for now, or for Scotland and Northern Ireland. So we are not able to provide a UK-wide picture, or we are not able to look at variations across recent immigrant cohorts or by reasons for migration. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion at the end.
Thank you, Ezgi. I think we're going to move over to Xiaowei now.
Hi, thanks very much for having me. Can you see my slides, hopefully?
Yes, they're there now.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Great. So I'm Xiaowei Xu, I'm at the IFS, and I'm presenting progress with Francesca Poliano at UCL, where we look at the link between geographical inequality, geographical mobility, and social mobility. So in my bit of the presentation, I'm going to talk you through some patterns of geographical mobility, and then Francesca is going to talk more about the link to social mobility in the next presentation. So just as a bit of background, there are huge inequalities in labour market outcomes across the UK, and these differences are very persistent over time. And in previous work I've done, I've shown that statistically speaking, most of these differences in earnings can be accounted for by differences in the types of people who live across places. So in particular, high-skilled workers are very geographically concentrated, and they tend to live in places that pay more for a given type of individual, which then magnifies their individual advantages. At the same time, previous work has also shown that young people in England are very mobile. So by age 27, over a third of graduates and more than 1 in 7 non-graduates live in a travel to work area in a local labour market that's not the one they grew up in. So people are very mobile. And, putting these two things together, we think that patterns of mobility are very important because they could either mitigate or exacerbate geographical inequalities in human capital and therefore in earnings. And also to the extent that different groups move in different ways, in particular if there are differences across socioeconomic classes, patterns of mobility could also have an effect on social mobility. So in our project, we use data from the longitudinal education outcomes dataset, the LEO dataset, which links administrative records from schools, universities, further education institutions, as well as the tax and benefit records. So really creating an amazing dataset with which to study the early career trajectories of recent cohorts. The earliest cohort in the LEO data did their GCSEs in 2002. So in the latest data that we have, they're sort of age 34, 35. And in our analysis, we exclude people in full-time education, just looking at people who are already in the labour market. The LEO data also contains geographical identifiers, looking at where people live at different points in time. Unfortunately, on the tax side, the geographical identifiers we found are only reliable from the 2012 tax year onwards. So that's the period we look at here. So in terms of what we do, we start out by characterizing people in places based on their earnings potential and their pay levels. And without getting into technical terms, we do this quickly by running an AKM regression, which essentially we're following the same individuals over time as they move from one travel to work area to the next and looking at how their pay changes and using that to infer the different earnings premiums that different places offer. So through this regression approach, we estimate a travel to work area fixed effect for each travel to work area in England, which describes the local earnings premium a given type of individual can expect when they work in that travel to work area. And we also estimate an individual fixed effect, which describes how much a given individual would expect to earn irrespective of where they worked. So you can think of this as their human capital endowment, or at times I'm going to very loosely call this skills, even though it's not just skills. It's also, their demographic characteristics, other things that are fixed that affect their earnings over time. But skills is easier to say than human capital endowment, which is a bit of a mouthful. And throughout, we're controlling for year effects and the total years of experience. So having estimated these travel to work area fixed effects and individual fixed effects, we use these estimates to describe patterns of mobility in people's early careers. So we focus on two cohorts, the 2002 and 2003 GCSE cohorts, who are up to age 33, 34 in our data. And we look at two periods in their lives. So an early period between age 16 and age 27, which we can think of as, the start of their careers where people choose to move to start out. And then we look at mobility between ages 27 and 33. So a time when, people are thinking about settling down, maybe having kids, or at least starting to think about having children. So that's sort of later migration. We look at how patterns of mobility differ across these two periods, and then we discuss implications on geographical inequality. So I should note that this project is still very much work in progress, and this in particular is an area we're still working on, but I'll show you some preliminary results. So just to set this up, it's worth noting, which you probably already know, that there are large differences in earnings across local labour markets in England. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing you raw fixed effects without controlling for individual characteristics. The map on the right-hand side shows differences controlling for individual characteristics using this AKM regression. And basically, that reduces the extent of variation across travel to work areas, but large differences still remain. The difference in fixed effects between the lowest paying and highest paying areas, once we control for individual effects, is 18 log points, and the difference between the 10th percentile and 90th percentile is 9 log points. So roughly half the differences in the raw data. Okay, so let's move on to describing these patterns of mobility. So who moves and where do they move? So let's start by looking at patterns of net migration across travel to work areas. So what we find is that net migration is positively correlated with the local earnings premium for graduates, but not for non-graduates. So that's to say that graduates are moving away from areas with low pay premiums towards areas that are higher paying. So at the top, you've got sort of London, to the top right. The other ones sort of in the middle towards the top are Brighton, Bristol and Leeds. So people are moving towards these places that are higher paying. Another thing you can see in this chart is that the size of the dots represents the populations of these areas. And so you see that for a given level of local earnings premiums, graduates are choosing to move to bigger areas, right? So they're moving away from rural areas and into cities. So moving away from this very crude distinction between graduates and non-graduates, we use the individual fixed effects that we estimate to capture people's human capital level at a more granular level. So what we do is we take these individual fixed effects and we group them into 20 equally sized groups, with the highest skilled individuals to the right of this chart and the lowest skilled individuals to the left. And on this chart, I'm showing you the probability of moving by their level of human capital endowment. And what you see here is that higher skilled people are more likely to move, especially towards the top of the skill distribution. So not only are they more likely to move overall, they're also more likely to move to higher paying places. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the same 20 groups of individuals and showing you the average pay premiums in their origin destination, so where they were at age 16, and their destination travel to work area, so where they were at age 27, and looking at the difference between the two. What you see is that the highest skilled individuals move to places that are much higher paying than where they came from, whereas this is not the case for the lower skilled individuals. So high skilled individuals are moving more, and they're also moving to places with much better pay, therefore exacerbating geographical differences. So this is all just, between the ages of 16 to 27, and a question I've been asked a lot on a previous paper that only looked up to age 27 is, well, what happens to mobility after that point? What happens when people, start to settle down, start to have kids? Do these effects go away? And to my knowledge, this is the first paper that tries to look at these effects, in part because the kids are just old enough in Leo to look at this. So the first thing to note here is that people do move a lot between age 27 and age 33. So this table here captures the sort of mobility trajectories in these two periods of time, looking at whether people move or stay between ages 16 and 27, and whether they move and stay between ages 27 and 33. And we see that a lot of people are still moving between the ages of 27 and 33. So of those who live in the same place at age 27 as they did at age 16, 15% of those then move in the second period, so by age 33, and that's high for graduates, so it's 26% for graduates. And of those who move in that first period, 40% will go on to make another move. Now, we distinguish between two types of moves here. The move return row refers to people who move and then they return to their origin travel to work area, whereas move onward refers to people who move once and then they move again, but not back to where they came from. So they move to another travel to work area. And one thing we can see here is that actually onward moves are very common, especially for graduates. So for graduates, moving onward is much more common than returning back home for those who do move. So people are still moving between ages 27 and 33, but the nature of moves is often very different from the moves you see in this first period. In particular, on average, migration between age 27 and 33 is towards lower paying travel to work areas, whereas migration in the first period is very much towards higher paying travel to work areas. Another thing you see that's the opposite of the first period is that people are moving away from cities towards smaller travel to work areas. Now, you might think that these two things indicate that later moves undo some of the effects of the first period moves, but we find that actually this is not the case. And in fact, it exacerbates differences in human capital. And this is because of three things. So the first is that many high-skilled people are moving for the first time. So they hadn't moved by age 27, but then they start to move and they're moving towards higher paying travel to work areas. They're moving to London, moving to other cities. The second point is that return migration is negatively selected. So of the people who do move in this first period, the ones who return are the ones with lower levels of human capital. And a third point is that onward migration from London is primarily towards prosperous areas, more rural areas in the southeast, rather than to left behind areas. So just to show you what this looks like in terms of the geographical distribution, we can map the effects of mobility on human capital across places by looking at the change in the average estimated individual fixed effect across travel to work areas. So this is the change in the average level of human capital across places between ages 16, based on where people are from, and age 27, based on where they've moved to, right? And this map shows that London is a huge beneficiary of mobility patterns in terms of raising its level of human capital, whereas lots of places in the north, in the southwest, lose out as a result of migration. So I've highlighted London, but that's not the only place that there's other places you see in the sort of light green, yellowish colours on this map that also gain, and these tend to be cities, so places like Bristol, Brighton, Oxford, Leeds, Manchester, and Newcastle at the top over there. So this looks at migration up to age 27. Well, what happens by age 33? So the map on the right now shows the change between ages 16 and 33, as opposed to 16 and 27. And as I'd already alluded to, it seems like further migration in people's late 20s and early 30s actually exacerbates these differences in human capital. So the dark areas on the map to the left-hand side get a bit darker still when you look at the map on the right-hand side. So for example, if you look at Cornwall or you look at Lincolnshire, these places are further losing skills through migration. And one interesting thing to note is that the areas around London are gaining skills, right? So these colours are lighter than the map to the left. What's happening here? Well, it's sort of alluded to it, but it's essentially people moving out of London into these areas. So high skilled people leaving London to the immediate vicinity. So in these maps here, I'm showing you on the left-hand side, moves to London in this first period between age 16 and 27 as a percentage of the local resident population. And on the right-hand side, I'm showing you moves from London between age 27 and 33, again, relative to the local population. And I think what's really striking is that London is really drawing people from all over the country at the very start of people's careers. And then as people start to settle down, people are leaving London, but not back to where they came from. They're leaving London and going to the immediate vicinity of London and perhaps still continuing to work in London. So London performs this really interesting role geographically in actually redistributing people across the country. We've done these maps for other cities like Bristol and Leeds and Manchester, and for all those places, the effects look very different. So they draw people from the immediate vicinity and then people move out to the immediate vicinity, whereas London's really reshaping the distribution of skills across the country. Okay, so to quickly conclude what I've shown you just now, we find that high-skilled people move to high-paying areas at the start of their careers, exacerbating differences in human capital across places. And we find that mobility in people's late 20s and early 30s does not undo these effects, and in fact, further exacerbates the inequalities in human capital that we see. So in terms of next steps, what we're working on now is trying to really quantify the contribution of mobility to geographical earnings inequality. And ideally, we'd like to do this in a way that takes into account the dynamic effects of places on people's earnings progression. So far, I've just talked about sort of, static premiums in earnings that people get across places. But one thing we see in the data is that earnings growth is actually also faster in London and a handful of other places than in the rest of the country. And so people who move to London not only get the higher static effect of living in London, but are also likely to get higher returns to experience, which perhaps they could take with them as they move to other places. So we're trying to deal with this now. The issue here is that the geographical data is only reliable from 2012 onwards, so we don't actually have the full migration histories of the older cohorts in the data, but we're thinking about what we could do here. Okay, so I think I'll end here and I'll pass on to Francesca, who's going to talk more about the social mobility side of things.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my slides?
Yes, that looks great, Francesca. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so thank you very much, Shoei. I will continue by presenting some additional results from our project on economic opportunities and geographical mobility of young adults in England. As mentioned before, my research, as well as Shoei's research, has been funded by ADR UK. I just wanted to mention this. Okay, Sorry, just very quickly, some motivations. Very much overlap my motivations, the ones already presented by Joey, but I just wanted to mention them because it kind of introduce the discussion about social mobility. So we know from previous literature and previous work by Joey that there are large geographical disparities in labor market in labor market outcomes across England, and this is very important because according to economic models, geographical disparities should dissipate through labor mobility, that is, workers moving across local labor markets. However, more recent empirical papers that have been studying negative employment and wage shocks have found that actually this is not really the case. There is very little adjustment in the presence of negative economic opportunities, and if there is some movement, is actually driven by individuals from wealthier backgrounds and also more skilled and more educated workers. So this actually takes us to the conclusion that the geographical mobility might exacerbate differences across areas, which is what Joey just presented, but also if geographical mobility brings individuals to encounter better job match and therefore better wages, and if individuals who actually move are mostly individuals from wealthier backgrounds, then geographical mobility can actually hinder social mobility. So we try to look at data from the LEO dataset to try to understand whether this is the case, whether we can say something about this. Okay, so very similar to Joey, we use LEO data. We in particular, we focus, I'll present some results on a bigger number of observations. I consider all individuals who took their GCSE between 2002 to 2012, and we can observe in the data from 2012, in the LEO data from 2012 onwards, and who are at least 25 years of age. So most regressions will be based on this sample. We define migrant as individuals, for the regression analysis, we define migrant as individuals who have left their travel to work area of origin. That is the travel to work area where we observed them originally at age 16 when they are still in school. Once they leave the travel to work area, once we observe them in a different travel to work area, we define them as migrant. Our definition of local labor market is the travel to work area, which is a geographical entity defined by ONS, where around 75% of individuals live and work. And as I mentioned, the total sample is around 5 million individuals observed from 25 onwards, who are in employment and they're not in full-time education for the period 2012-2021, where 2012 in particular, because as mentioned by Joey, the geographical information from before are not totally reliable, or they don't cover the old sample. Finally, in terms of methods, very similar to what Joey has already presented, we will use some results from AKM regressions in order to present some descriptive analysis, and then we will use estimates from wage regressions that include individual characteristics and school by cohort fixed effects. And this is to try to absorb as much heterogeneity as possible and obtain an estimate of the migration premium. Okay, so as already mentioned, English young adults are very mobile. Here we present the probability of living in different travel to work areas at different ages, between 25 and 33 for men and women. And as we can observe, by 33, around 30% of all individuals live in a different travel to work area compared to where they were at age 16. So in terms of also comparing with other OECD countries, English young adults are quite mobile. Okay, this is interesting, but in order to understand whether there is an effect on whether migration might kind of hinder social mobility, we need to understand who are the individuals who move and where they go, and whether they gain from this move. So here I present the proportion of movers by higher education status. This is for age 30, so all individuals in Leo who are age 30. So the proportion of movers by higher education status for each quintile of the distribution of a socioeconomic status of their background measured for when they were 16. So what we observe here is that the movers who are non-graduates are represented by the green bar, and the movers who are graduates are represented by the blue bar at the bottom of these stacked bars. And I do these proportions are presented for males and females, for men and women separately, but the pattern is very similar. So the takeaway from this chart is that actually the wealthier young adults are more likely to migrate. We see that the proportion of migrants, particularly graduate migrants, increases with the socioeconomic status. So the individuals who are, and also graduates are more likely to migrate than non-graduates, as already mentioned by Xiaowei. So the takeaway is that graduates, again, are more likely to migrate than non-graduates, and in the total sample, wealthier young adults are more likely to have moved from the travel to work area where they were originally than less wealthy young adults. Okay, so we already can see that wealthier young adults are more likely to move. We need to understand whether there is also a wage premium. And in order to do so, we need to see where they go. We need to have an idea where they go. So here, this is a chart very similar to one presented by Xiaowei before, where we show the patterns of net migration, the correlation between patterns on net migration and the earning premiums by travel to work area. And as already mentioned by Xiaowei, we see that there's not much correlation. There's no correlation for non-graduates, whereas for graduates, their pattern of migration seems to be driven by the earning premiums, in particular by London, which has the highest earning premiums, and some other big cities where with higher earning premiums. So we already see that there is a clear difference between graduates and non-graduates in terms of where they move, and if we characterize the areas where they move by the earning premiums. I want to mention that these earning premiums, as explained before by Xiaowei, come from an AKM regression. Okay, so there's difference between graduates and non-graduates, but what about within graduates? What can we say about low socioeconomic status graduates versus high socioeconomic status graduates? Well, what we observe here is that actually this clear pattern of graduates moving towards areas with higher earning premium is driven by graduates from high SES, so wealthier graduates. Okay. So there are differences. So far, we've seen that graduates are more likely to migrate than non-graduates, and more generally, wealthier young adults are more likely to migrate than less wealthy young adults. There are differences between graduates and non-graduates in where they move, and even within graduates, there are differences due to their socioeconomic status. Okay, what can we say about this migration? Then, from this descriptive analysis, it seems that wealthier graduates go towards areas that have higher premiums. But we want to understand this and we want to estimate what's the migration premium. We do so by using a wage regression. And here we present estimates of the migration premium for men and women separately, and for by gender for graduates and non-graduates across the distribution of socioeconomic status for the 5 quintile of the distribution of the socioeconomic status measured at age 16. And what we observe here is that this premium is much higher for graduates than non-graduates. The graduates are the kind of light brown color, and the non-graduates are the red represented by the red color. So the estimates for graduates and non-graduates are represented by these colors. So what we observe is that the wage premium, the migration premium for graduates is much higher than for non-graduates, and for graduate men is higher than for graduate women. For men it's between 10 to 15%, for women between 5 and 10%. And for non-graduates is even negative. But what is very interesting about these results is that actually there is a socioeconomic status gradient in these migration premium. So the premium is higher for individuals from with higher socioeconomic status, both for men and women. And this is an important result because it highlights the fact that, first of all, there is a positive premium, a migration premium from moving away from the local labor market of origin, and we know that wealthier individuals are more likely to move. But also this premium has a kind of gradient, a socioeconomic status gradient, and so wealthier individuals gain more from these moves than less wealthy young adults. And this is important because, just an additional result to say that this gradient seems to be driven mostly by the growth of the premium over time. So there is a clear, whereas there seems to be no gradient at age 26, for men, we observe a clear gradient, an SES gradient by wage 33. So by wage 33, there is a very clear difference between individuals with high SES in terms of migration premium versus individuals with low SES. This is to say that this difference in the migration premium might actually exacerbate the differences that we already observe in terms of the baseline in earnings, differences between low SES and high SES in the baseline, which is represented by individuals who don't move. We see here that there is a clear difference between the first two quantiles of the distribution of SES in terms of earnings and the top three quantiles. And so positive premiums that are higher for wealthier young adults might exacerbate the earning gap. So I'm just going to conclude here to say that geographical mobility allows movers to obtain better job match and economic opportunities. If young adults from more disadvantaged backgrounds are less likely to move or move to places with lower wages and lower wage growth compared to their peers from more advantaged backgrounds, then the geographical mobility will hinder social mobility by increasing the earning gap. We show the graduates, in particular high SES graduates, are more likely to move, and they move to areas with greater wage premiums. And mobility earning premium is higher for graduate men, and it increases across the distribution of the socioeconomic status of their background. So these might widen the already existing gap in earnings between low and high SES young adults. And that's it. Thank you.